Good afternoon and welcome to the 1994 Class Day Address here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. I'm Albert Carnesdale, Dean of the school, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you here today in this very special time for our graduates and their families and their friends. Today we're honored to have with us as our speaker the United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Madeleine Albright. Once asked for a shorthand biography, Ambassador Albright began, and I quote, "A woman, Democrat, international affairs specialist, university professor, mother of 3 daughters," close quote. Let me try to fill in some of the blanks from this overly modest description. In 1948, a very young Madeleine Albright and her family fled from the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia and came to the United States. She did pretty well here, graduating from Wellesley College with honors and earning master's and PhD degrees in public law and government from Columbia universities. Both graduate degrees were earned commuting between New York and Washington while raising those 3 young daughters. Her previous experience in government includes service as Chief Legislative Assistant for Senator Edmund Muskie and as a member of the National Security Council staff in President Carter's administration. Since 1982, Ambassador Albright has been at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service as a research professor of international affairs and director of the Women in Foreign Service program. She served as Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to Michael Dukakis in his campaign in 1988, and after that became president of the Center for National Policy, a nonprofit research organization. Since her January 1993 appointment as U.S. Permanent Representative to the UN, she's been shaping the increasingly critical relationship between the United States and the United Nations. In addition to promoting democracy and easing humanitarian suffering, she's been a leading figure in the effort to resolve the issues associated with North Korea's nuclear program. I've had the pleasure of knowing Madeleine Albright for a number of years. She's an outstanding scholar of international affairs, and she speaks and reads French, Czech, Russian, Polish, and fortunately for us, English. She's spoken in this forum before in English, and it's a delight to have her back again. We Americans are fortunate to have such an accomplished scholar and diplomat representing us to the world. When she was appointed United Nations Ambassador, Madeleine Albright said, and again I quote, "As a result of the generous spirit of the American people, our family had the privilege of growing up as free Americans. You can therefore understand how proud I will be to sit at the United Nations behind the nameplate that says United States of America." Well, we're proud to have her sitting behind that nameplate. Please join me in welcoming the United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Madeleine Albright.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Dean Carnesdale. It is indeed a pleasure to be here in a place where I have been before, never introduced quite so elegantly, and a great pleasure to be able to meet with all of you on this very special day for you. It is without a doubt that this school is one of America's most prestigious and accomplished graduate schools. And this afternoon, we come together to mark the end of another academic year. And it is indeed a day to celebrate. After all, graduation is one of the 5 great milestones of life, the others being birth, marriage, death, and the day you finally pay off your student loan. As a former professor, I have attended many ceremonies such as this, and only one thing can mar them, and that is the commencement speech. A commencement speaker is like the body at an Irish wake. Everyone says nice things about you, but you're neither expected nor encouraged to say very much. So I promise not to bore you, at least intentionally, and I will try to control the habit developed while a professor, of speaking in sound bites 50 minutes long. But because I am a former professor, I cannot resist talking about the future in light of the past, especially this week when we are surrounded by reminders of World War II. I will begin, therefore, by citing remarks made here at Harvard by Walter Lippmann in the summer of 1940. Europe, though not yet America, had been plunged into war, and Lippmann, speaking to a reunion of his class, faulted his own generation for failing the test of history. He said that after World War I, his generation had refused to organize the peace because that would have been too much trouble. When it saw great evil arise in Europe and Asia, it had disapproved but not resisted, because disapproval was easy and resistance was hard. When it saw savage crimes committed, it assured itself that the criminal impulse would not last nor cross the ocean. And when it was confronted by the possibility of war, it responded with confusion and complacency, and thereby assured the reality of war. This generation, said Lippmann, has suffered, and I quote, a disaster of character, renounced indispensable virtues, and dissipated the inheritance of freedom. The cost of the failure of which Lippmann spoke is measured in the thousands of white crosses and stars of David now freshly adorned with flowers in cemeteries along the coast of Normandy. There lie the remains of young men and women who, when called upon, demonstrated precisely the indispensable virtues of which Lippmann spoke. It is fitting in this day of celebration to recall their bravery and mourn their unfulfilled dreams. It is also imperative that we ponder the relevance to our own character and time of Lippmann's stark words. For we too have a responsibility in the aftermath of a great struggle to organize the peace. We too face the risk of confusion and the temptation of complacency. We too must find and affirm indispensable virtues. To be sustainable, American foreign policy must be guided by American interests. But in the wake of the Cold War, a whole category of conflicts has arisen in which the American state resists precise calculation. Certainly, the dangers are less clear and present than Soviet missiles targeted on our homes. But there is ample precedent within this century for conflicts in remote regions coming home to America. Few felt in 1914 that an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo would cause thousands of American soldiers to cross the Atlantic, many never to return. Few understood that invasions of Manchuria in 1931, Ethiopia in 1935, and Czechoslovakia in 1939 would end not with peace in our time, but in world war. The globe is far smaller now than it was then. Weapons cost less but can destroy more at further range. Borders provide little protection from deadly drugs or death-dealing terrorists. Economies are interdependent. Populations, including our own, are highly mobile, and images of heroism and horror are transmitted instantly and constantly to and from every corner of the earth. In such a world, there is no perfect scale or formula for categorizing what is important to our people. Obviously, there remains an inner circle of vital interests related to the defense of our people, territory, allies, and economic well-being. Here, unilateral action, if required, is warranted and would likely have full support from Congress and the American people. Increasingly, we also recognize an outer circle of important interests that we share with others. Global issues such as the health of the atmosphere, limiting population growth, controlling international crime, and curbing AIDS fall within this circle. Here, multilateral action is essential, for national action alone is not sufficient. But between and sometimes overlapping these two, there is a middle circle, a gray area of regional conflicts and potential conflicts that does not fit neatly into any national security framework, but which, if left unattended, could erode the foundation of freedom and threaten world peace. Here, the destructive legacy of the Cold War is most evident, and the challenge of organizing the peace most complex. Here, regional organizations and regional powers have an important role. Here, the American stake may shift dramatically with changing circumstance and must be evaluated case by case, day by day. These regional problems do not affect us equally or in the same way. Some, such as Somalia or Rwanda, are primarily humanitarian concern. But this afternoon I will discuss 4 situations which, if not well managed, could pose threats to the innermost circle of American concerns. Here our interests are especially compelling and the risks especially high. In each case, our goal is to shape events so that our most vital interests are secure. In each, we are using a range of foreign policy tools. In each, multilateral institutions are involved, and in each, American leadership and the support and engagement of the American people is required. First, North Korea. This week at the United Nations, we are asking other nations to support economic sanctions. We will not acquiesce in North Korea's failure to meet its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. A nuclear North Korea would threaten regional security in Northeast Asia and undermine the international non-proliferation regime. In so doing, it would affect alliances and interests that bear on the security of our own people. Our firm objective, which we are pursuing deliberately and consistently, is a non-nuclear Korean peninsula. Experience informs us that sanctions alone rarely cause even isolated regimes to reverse course. But sanctions are needed now to demonstrate international seriousness and resolve, and they are needed to provide an incentive for corrective action and a disincentive for further backsliding. North Korea should know that the capacity to threaten use of nuclear weapons will not enhance its own security, but rather weaken it. Not ease its economic hardship, but rather worsen it. Not end its isolation, but rather deepen it. The diplomatic option remains open and the best course for all sides. If North Korea will acknowledge and abide by its obligations, it will open the door to resume discussions and to more normal and rewarding relationship with the world. The sanctions now under discussion are intended to promote, not derail, prospects for a peaceful resolution. But North Korea should also know that America will stand by its allies and that we will be steadfast in assisting South Korea in the protection of its territory and its people. Haiti is another country where we have turned to the tool of economic sanctions. Here again, our preference is to resolve a difficult situation peacefully. Our goal is to pressure General Cedras and other military leaders to go so that democracy may return. Both the UN and the OAS have authorized tougher sanctions and improved enforcement. The Dominican Republic has moved in recent days to seal its border with Haiti, and we will soon take steps to tighten the economic noose even further. In Haiti, as in Korea, we cannot assume that sanctions alone will work. To further isolate the military and to prepare for what may happen in the future, we will seek approval of a UN peacekeeping force to provide training and promote calm once the military leaders have left. Clearly, the status quo in Haiti is not tenable. The longer the current impasse continues, the greater is the potential for violence, the more severe is the suffering of Haiti's poor majority, and the more irreversible is the environmental degradation caused by scavenging for fuel. Haitians should not be asked to survive indefinitely on humanitarian relief. The hemisphere should not be asked to put up indefinitely with a criminal regime. And the legal and moral dilemma posed by those fleeing Haiti can only truly be resolved by addressing the problem at its source. Haitians must be able to live freely and securely at home. There are some who say we should simply let events in Haiti run their course, that we should ignore the theft of democracy and knuckle under to the thugs now in charge. They say that Haiti does not have a strong democratic tradition. But our goal in Haiti is not to create democratic government, it is to restore a democratic government elected with 70% of the vote. It is the goal of our administration, as it has been of previous ones, to help emerging democracies. We are doing so in cooperation with others in every corner of the world, from Mozambique to Cambodia to South Africa to Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Obviously, we cannot insulate every new democracy from the plot of usurpers, but Haiti is in our own backyard. The Haitian people deserve to live in freedom, and we are determined to see that they do. In the Balkans, we see another challenge that engages our interests and where current tragedy could grow still worse. The conflict there knows no natural boundaries. The fuse of potential violence lies coiled like a snake across the region. A wider conflagration could threaten us strategically by undermining new democracies in Eastern Europe, dividing our NATO allies, and straining our relationship with Russia. We have a humanitarian interest in opposing the brutal violence, including acts of genocide that have outraged the conscience and uprooted hundreds of thousands from their homes. And we have a political interest in opposing Serbia's efforts to use its Bosnian surrogates to undermine a sovereign state. We have responded to this most complex of international crises on a variety of fronts. To discourage aggression, we have supported tough enforcement of economic sanctions and sent peacekeepers to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And we have used NATO air power to restore a semblance of normal life to Sarajevo, to lend belated credibility to the concept of safe havens, and to maintain a humanitarian lifeline that has kept hundreds of thousands alive despite the bitter fighting. In the name of justice, we are backing the War Crimes Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, because true reconciliation will not be possible in that region until collective guilt for past atrocities is expunged and individual responsibility is assigned. And to promote peace, we have increased our diplomatic engagement. We helped broker an agreement between government and Bosnian Croat factions that has stopped the fighting in central Bosnia and improved prospects for Bosnia's survival as a multi-ethnic state. Americans have an important stake in the viability of that state, for we derive our own identity from the conviction that those of different races, creeds, and ethnic origins can live together productively, freely, and in peace. A fourth example of the challenges we face in this new era, and another place where multi-ethnic states are being tested, is the former Soviet Union. It is no surprise that none of the new independent states, including Russia, were fully prepared when independence arrived. It is far easier to redraw lines on a map than to remake the political habits of a lifetime. Today, the former Soviet Union is riddled with open and potential conflict. Causes include hard economic conditions, personal rivalries, and ethnic groups dissatisfied with communist-imposed borders. Relations among the new republics remain unsettled, and while the infrastructure of empire is unraveling, the infrastructure of democracy is not yet fully built. We are concerned, as are Russian and other responsible leaders throughout the former Soviet Union, that if current conflicts spread, other regional powers could be drawn in, economic development will be slow, democratic reforms will be curtailed, and a new flood of refugees will crowd the international relief system. Our policy is to buttress the sovereignty and the independence of the new states while promoting constructive relations among them and with Russia. We are using active diplomacy, economic and humanitarian aid that will amount to almost $2.5 billion this year, and a frank and open dialogue with the leaders of Russia and the other republics. Russia has the resources and leadership required to help resolve regional problems, but for obvious historical reasons, its role is sensitive. Recent electoral gains made by extreme nationalists have aggravated the situation. Vladimir Zhirinovsky has accused the government of pursuing policies of accommodation that will lead to, and I quote, slow murder of the Russian nation, unquote. Meanwhile, officials in Moscow have been defining and promoting Russia's national interests vigorously, including the protection of millions of ethnic Russians who live in the Russian near abroad. Although Russia desires stability, there have been troubling aspects to its policy towards the new republics. Russian military units stationed in Georgia and Moldova have exacerbated local conflicts. Instead of cooperating fully with international bodies, Russia has often pursued a go-it-alone strategy towards negotiations in Nagorno-Karabakh. And Russia has occasionally used its economic clout, especially in the energy sector, to pressure its neighbors. We have been frank with Russia. We believe that requests for UN peacekeeping missions in the former Soviet Union should be subject to the same guidelines as operations elsewhere. That means that tough questions must be asked in advance about mission, scope, duration, cost, and risk. In Georgia, a fundamental test of peacekeeping in the former Soviet Union is imminent. Violence there has displaced hundreds of thousands of people, severed vital transportation lines, and made economic and social progress impossible. With Russia's support, Georgia asked the UN to deploy a multilateral peacekeeping force, but a UN force would not be viable in the absence of substantial progress towards a political agreement and a common understanding by the parties as to where such a force would be deployed and what it would do. And so far, this has not occurred. The parties have now asked for a Russian-led CIS peacekeeping operation. We would prefer that they work instead to establish conditions necessary for a UN force to deploy. But if a CIS force does go in, it should be impartial, it should operate in agreement with the parties, it should respect Georgia's territorial integrity, and it should conduct itself in accordance with the UN Charter and the principles of CSCE. Elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, we're focusing on preventive diplomacy. President Clinton has worked in partnership with President Yeltsin to reduce the number of Russian troops in the Baltics from more than 120,000 2 years ago to less than 10,000 today. And the president's intervention helped seal the trilateral accord with Russia and Ukraine, affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity and establishing a roadmap for the removal of nuclear weapons from Ukrainian soil. The day may come when we will not think of the former Soviet Union in terms of regional problems, but rather regional strengths. The day may come when we see a region characterized by peaceful and independent democracies, each with its own personality, and a Russia whose greatness has been reconfirmed and yet redefined in terms appropriate to the present and the future. The day may come when we see a Europe fully liberated from spheres of influence and artificial divisions linked by open societies, open markets, common interests, and common values. The fulfillment of that vision will not come without setbacks, without great patience, or without faith. The people of the new independent states will bear, as they know they must, the primary burden. Our task is to work with them, not impose upon them, to help them to build their own societies and to establish relationships based on shared recognition and respect. In so doing, we validate our own values, preserve our own interests, and secure the gains of freedom for which so many in the West and East sacrifice so much. In each of the areas I've cited today, Korea, Haiti, Bosnia, and the former Soviet Union, the United Nations Security Council has a key part to play. The end of superpower rivalry has made cooperation possible, so peacekeeping and sanctions, little used previously, have moved to center stage. Each entered to high expectations, each has since received mixed reviews. The administration's strategy has been to use these tools assertively to supplement diplomatic, political, and military initiatives we have taken on our own. We have sought at the same time to hone these tools, to make sanctions a more precise instrument of policy, and to make UN peacekeeping more disciplined and more effective. Although our effort to reform UN peacekeeping has bipartisan support, there are some in Congress who would either pull the plug altogether or so restrict funding as to make the management of peacekeeping impossible. Last month, an amendment was offered in the House of Representatives that would, in the words of Defense Secretary Perry, have brought, and I quote, about the virtual collapse of UN peacekeeping, unquote. It would have jeopardized current peacekeeping operations in Cyprus, sanctions enforcement in Iraq, and the separation of hostile forces in the tinderbox of the Middle East. And it would have made new UN peacekeeping operations anywhere in the world untenable, regardless of whether they would serve American interests. It is sobering that an amendment so contrary to American interests and traditions could have been offered and only narrowly defeated. Our ability to manage the problems I have discussed today in Haiti, Bosnia, and the former Soviet Union would be seriously undermined if UN peacekeeping were no longer an option. And the chance of gaining support from other countries for our policy towards North Korea would also diminish. This is the kind of thinking, the kind of retreat from responsibility that Lippmann warned his generation about more than half a century ago. And it is contrary to the kind of bipartisan foreign policy that responsible leaders from both parties wish to create. If we are going to meet the challenges of this new era, we will need to use every tool available: a strong defense, strong alliances, vigorous diplomacy, better UN peacekeeping, more effective multilateral sanctions, and firm support for the requirements of international law. We need to understand, as the late Senator Henry Jackson once said, that international peace and security depend not on a parity of power, but on a preponderance of power that favors the peacekeepers over the peace upsetters. The reassuring lesson of D-Day is that a free people, when fully aroused in the face of great danger, can respond with boundless courage and nobility. The cautionary lesson is that any people, in the absence of a perceived clear and present danger, can fall into complacency. Last Monday afternoon, at a U.S. military cemetery in France, President Clinton paid his respects to those who gave their lives on the beaches of Normandy half a century ago. These were the words that he said: "The fathers we never knew, the uncles we never met, the friends who never returned, the heroes we can never repay." It may be that we can never be fully worthy of their sacrifice, but it is certain that to be worthy at all, we cannot turn inward or stand still. To do so would be to dissipate the heritage of freedom and to renounce indispensable virtues. President Clinton referred at the very end of his remark to the pathfinders, to the paratroopers who were the first to land at Normandy, where deep in the darkness they lit beacons for the airborne assault that would follow. Addressing the veterans directly, the president then said that, now, near the dawn of a new century, the job of lighting those beacons falls into our hands. To you who brought us here, I promise we will be the new pathfinders, for we are the children of your sacrifice. There are those who suggest that America's challenges at home justify turning away from responsibilities abroad. But as the tears shed at Normandy suggest, there is no more local an issue than whether our young men and women will once again be forced to fight big wars because we failed to prevent the small ones. There are few more salient economic issues than whether we will have to resume a military buildup because of setbacks in Moscow or because nuclear weapons have fallen into the wrong hands. And there are few questions more vital for our children than whether we will bequeath to them a world that is relatively stable or one that is brutal, anarchic, and violent. We have a responsibility in our time, as others had in theirs, to be pathfinders, not to be imprisoned by history, but to shape it, to build a world not without conflict, but in which conflict is effectively contained, a world not without repression, but in which the sway of freedom is enlarged, a world not without lawless behavior, but in which the law-abiding are progressively more secure. That is our mission as we enter this new era, and that is your assignment as you enter your new life. Congratulations, and thank you very much.
let me invite all of you now to a reception in honor of Ambassador Albright, right behind this platform.